Governor DeSantis' promise to stop the influx of undocumented immigrants into the Sunshine State appears to be intensifying, this time with children, even babies, feeling its most recent impact. That's because a week ago, this Sarasota facility known as the Dream Center was forced to remove all of the nearly 60 unaccompanied children in its care.
Half of them were 13 or under.
Sam Sipes is CEO of Lutheran Services, which operates the center.
It was incredibly emotional for the kids and for the staff, yes. This place was, for many of those children, I would say for most of those children, the first place they've ever felt safe.
The Dream Center is one of more than a dozen Florida facilities that temporarily house unaccompanied children who come into the state legally under the Fed's Office of Refugee Resettlement, a federally funded program that assists undocumented people seeking asylum here. The problem, while the center is federally funded and operated, it must have a state license to house children. And weeks after submitting all the necessary paperwork for its annual renewal, Florida's Department of Children and Families has yet to renew that license or even tell them anything at all.
We received no response. We didn't receive a denial, we didn't receive an acceptance, and we weren't able to get answers from anyone in state government regarding the disposition of our license renewal.
Without a license, the center had no other choice but to move all of the kids in its care to other licensed shelters in the state. Some were even moved out of the state altogether.
Sad time.
Yeah. It really is. These are real people's lives at stake. It's very sad. And these 50-plus children were traumatized yet again by having to move in a hurry because we couldn't get clarity about our license status.
In a desperate attempt to get answers, Lutheran Services is now taking DCF to court, asking a judge to weigh in on DCF's apparent no response. But answers over why this federally funded center isn't getting the state's blessing may go back to this.
We have to put Florida children first.
Back in September, Governor DeSantis signed this executive order directly against the president's immigration policies. In it, he essentially directs state agencies to stop supporting federal programs transporting to the state, quote, aliens apprehended at the southwest border who do not have lawful status here. His order includes a directive to DCF. Unless there's an evidence of need, the department shall not grant or renew any license for shelters caring for unaccompanied children. In a lengthy statement, a governor's spokesperson cited the Biden administration, saying in part they continue to ignore his request to be notified on who, where, and when the feds send undocumented immigrants here. When asked what evidence of need means, the governor's spokesperson responded, it's still being established by DCF.
Children should not be political pawns.
Democratic Representative Anna Escamani of Orlando fears what this means for the other Florida shelters that temporarily house in total roughly 700 beds for unaccompanied children at any given time here.
The fact that all of a sudden our faith-based organizations supporting undocumented children is controversial, it's purely the governor playing politics. It's not good policy. And it causes a great deal of harm for those children and those organizations who now have to scramble to find a safe place for these kids to go.
What I want to make really clear is that this is not political for us.
Back at the Dream Center, its 100 employees are still being told to show up to work.
What would you tell these children?
I'm sorry, I think would be the first thing.
As they all wait for answers on what's next and if a nationwide political debate will leave them and the children they're called to help caught in the middle.
We're approaching the Christmas season too, and we really don't want to have to tell 11-year-old victims of human trafficking that there's no room in the inn.
DCF also has yet to respond to our questions about what's going on. Same with the feds. We know other shelters are also up for statewide license renewal over the next couple months. Meantime, Lutheran Services is asking a judge to require DCF get back to them either way within the next 30 days.
In this Florida home, 2 bedrooms remain fully furnished, the sheets made, handmade pictures hang on the wall. But the children who these rooms were designed for are gone.
So they had to move out right away?
Right away.
With no explanation on when or if any more children will ever return here.
What was it like saying goodbye?
Oh, it was hard. It was hard because, like I said, they get used to you.
He's a foster parent who for the past 7 years has cared for roughly 250 children who arrive in the state through the government's Unaccompanied Children's Program, created to temporarily care for unaccompanied kids until they are united with a relative or sponsor.
They are so humbled and so grateful. Yes, they are. Sorry.
He's asked us not to reveal his identity because he's concerned the state's child welfare agency will punish him for speaking out. For months, he and his wife have been waiting for Florida's Department of Children and Families to renew their license to house unaccompanied kids. But the agency has yet to tell them anything. Their license lapsed in September, forcing them to suddenly say goodbye to the teenage brother and sister they'd been looking after for weeks.
Heartbreaking. I couldn't believe it. I came in and cried.
Earlier this week, we were first to reveal the state's sudden and unusual silent treatment of facilities supporting unaccompanied children here. About a week ago, this federally funded shelter in Sarasota also had to relocate nearly 60 unaccompanied children, half of them under 13 years old, because the state wouldn't renew its license in time.
We received no response. I've never experienced this before, so I don't really understand.
The center now getting the courts involved, asking a judge to make DCF determine one way or the other if they'll be relicensed. In a lengthy statement, the governor's spokesperson cited the Biden administration and its lack of transparency in sharing who, when, and where it's sending undocumented people to in Florida. The governor now pushing back, broadly directing state agencies to stop supporting federal efforts, including this directive to DCF to, by and large, not renew the licenses of anyone caring for unaccompanied children.
People have a misrepresentation of these kids, you know. A lot of people think, you know, these kids, you know, they're gang members, they're killers, and, you know, they're rapists. No, it's not. It's everything the opposite.
Back in this home, art remains the handmade reminders of the children who have come and are now gone. This foster dad and his wife hold on to pictures and videos of the children they've served.
These are kids you're dealing with, you know, and all these kids deserve a second chance. They deserve a chance in life.
Praying politics doesn't stop the mission they believe they were meant for.
When you dedicate yourself so much to these kids and you give all you have in your heart, it hurts. It really hurts.
Despite our repeated requests to DCF on these licensing issues, we appear to be getting the silent treatment from them as well. DCF telling us they don't comment on pending litigation. More fallout from the governor's order that takes aim at unaccompanied children who land in Florida as part of a legal refugee settlement program. I discover if the feds are getting involved, and the American Academy of Pediatrics now voicing its concern. Florida's governor is playing politics with children.
Weeks after we were first to report how the state is inexplicably not renewing the licenses of shelters and foster homes that provide temporary care to unaccompanied children, members of the American Academy of Pediatrics are now calling on Governor DeSantis to revoke the executive order they say is behind this sudden new crackdown on kids.
Our governor has children himself. Like, I just can't imagine how this decision could be made, knowing that kids can't speak for themselves. They need to be protected.
Dr. Lisa Gwynn leads Florida's chapter and for years has worked with a mobile clinic in Miami that provides care to unaccompanied kids who cross the border and are reunited with family as part of the government's federal refugee resettlement program.
They're innocent. They're excited to be reunited with family. They're excited to be able to go to school and to live in safe communities. And doesn't every child deserve that?
They are farming out people all across communities across the United States, including here in Florida, yet they don't ever tell us what they're doing.
Similar to what Governor Abbott did in Texas over the summer, in September, Governor DeSantis issued this executive order directing state agencies not to support any federal programs, quote, transporting aliens apprehended at the southwest border. DeSantis said it was in response to what he called Biden's border crisis and an ongoing lack of transparency from the feds over who, when, and where they're resettling immigrants in Florida.
We're entitled to know, given that we bear the cost of most of this.
In his order, Florida's Department of Children and Families is directed not to renew the licenses of child care providers who temporarily care for unaccompanied children. Then a few weeks ago, this shelter in Sarasota was forced to relocate nearly 60 unaccompanied children in its care, half under 13, because DCF wouldn't renew its license in time and never explained why.
I've never experienced this before, so I don't really understand.
The center, operated by Lutheran Services of Tampa, is now taking DCF to court. Despite repeated requests, DCF not commenting or explaining to us what's going on. The feds telling us any questions about state licensing should be referred to the state. Meantime, in a statement, U.S. Congresswoman Lois Frankel of Palm Beach County said closing shelters is contrary to the values of our country. Unfortunately, the federal government has limited authority to intervene with the governor's inhumane actions. Frankel also now asking the governor to reverse his policy, which provides exception if DCF determines the resettlement of these children constitutes an evidence of need, though DCF has yet to publicly explain and define what that really means.
A child that doesn't have parents or a place to go, I mean, if that isn't evidence of need, I don't know what is. So we are all very, very confused.
With more than a dozen shelters in Florida working with the feds to temporarily care for unaccompanied children, the American Academy of Pediatrics is concerned about whose state license is up next and how many children could find themselves being uprooted again if Florida shuts down to them.
They're already up against so much. And now we're going to have our leadership strip their ability to have a safe place to be able to begin their lives in our country. It's just inexcusable.
A Lutheran spokesperson told us the feds recently granted them a waiver that allows them to operate without a state license. However, the organization is letting its court case go through the process to make sure they are legally able to take care of these unaccompanied children.
So today,
during a recent roundtable in Tampa on first responders and mental health,
Governor DeSantis,
we asked Florida Governor Ron DeSantis about migrant children and his order aimed at relocating them out of Florida.
Unaccompanied children are being forced out of shelters here in Florida because DCF is not renewing their license. This appears to be in direct response to your executive order that directed them not to renew the licenses of these providers that service specifically unaccompanied children. Governor, why are you bringing kids into this immigration debate?
I want our resources focused on needs for Florida kids and the needs we have in our communities. These are people that are coming from other countries. They shouldn't obviously be allowed into the country.
His response comes weeks after we were first to discover, as a result of an anti-immigration order he signed in September, Florida's Department of Children and Families has stopped renewing the annual licenses of federally funded shelters caring for unaccompanied kids who cross the border before they're reunited with family here.
This place was, for many of those children, I would say for most of those children, the first place they've ever felt safe. So yeah, sad.
Last month, this shelter in Sarasota had to relocate the nearly 60 migrant children in its care because the state wouldn't renew its license and never explained why.
These 50-plus children were traumatized yet again by having to move in a hurry because we couldn't get clarity about our license status.
Lutheran Services, which opened the shelter after a request from the Trump administration, now asking a judge to make DCF give them some answers.
Secretary Harris,
DCF and its boss,
Secretary, are you not going to renew any of these licenses?
Also giving us the silent treatment when we ask questions about it.
Children should not be political pawns.
I just can't imagine how this decision could be made knowing that kids they can't speak for themselves.
But despite calls from lawmakers and child advocates asking the governor to reverse this order and allow DCF to relicense these nonprofit shelters,
We want those resources focused on Florida kids and American kids.
the governor appeared committed to upholding his new policy.
We don't want to be the place where those kids are being put to the back of the line because Biden is airlifting people in from the southern border.
These are shelters that are
Okay,
federally
I've
funded.
answered your question. Thanks.
And that's all the governor would say about it. Meantime, an emergency hearing in the case between Lutheran Services and DCF is scheduled for this Friday. We'll be there.
Weeks after we were first to reveal how this Sarasota childcare shelter was forced to relocate all nearly 60 unaccompanied migrant kids in its care because the state wouldn't renew its license in time.
Governor DeSantis,
And a week after we questioned the governor about it,
why are you bringing kids into this immigration debate?
the shelter known as the Dream Center is suddenly granted a new annual license. The must-have state license provided just one day before Florida's Department of Children and Families was scheduled to explain to a judge why it had been stonewalling the center. A spokesperson for Lutheran Services, which opened the shelter in 2019 after a request from the Trump administration, telling us in a text, "We are thankful this issue has come to a resolution," adding, "With our license now in hand, we plan to resume operations and continue to support vulnerable children." But how long that mission will be able to continue in Florida remains unknown. The Dream Center is one of more than a dozen shelters in Florida that temporarily house unaccompanied migrant children after they've made it over the border, but before they're reunited with family or sponsors here. But it's these shelters also being targeted by Governor DeSantis as part of what he describes is Biden's border crisis, which have included secret nighttime flights moving migrants, including children, into Florida with no notice and no basic detail on who's coming in.
You don't know who any of these folks are.
In September, he ordered the state to stop renewing these shelters unless there was an evidence of need, which at the time hadn't been defined. Today, as the governor doubled down on illegal immigration, including his new policies impacting kids, DCF also issued this new emergency rule offering more detail on the future of shelters housing unaccompanied kids here.
In the short term, programs will likely be able to renew or retain their licenses. In the long term, we'll have to see.
Lisette Burton is a child care provider advocate. While the new rule won't impact shelters whose licenses expire within the next 45 days, it limits shelters from getting licensed to care for more kids and requires the feds give the state notice on kids coming in.
I don't think that the appropriate place to put pressure on changes for the immigration system is on the backs of really vulnerable children and on the backs of mission-driven, community-based organizations who are serving those children and serving them well.
The cartels are taking advantage of it. There's human smuggling, and it's just a really bad situation. So for us to be, as a country, basically facilitating that, that's a really, really bad policy. It is very hazardous.
Still so many questions as to how this will play out, but for Lutheran Services and the Dream Center, now that they've got their license, they look forward to accepting kids when remains unknown.
If Florida will close its doors to unaccompanied migrant kids remains a question the feds who send these children here are asking the state to set straight. In this letter we obtained, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services wants the DeSantis administration to clarify a series of confusing new state rules for shelters that temporarily care for unaccompanied migrant children as part of a decades-old program. In the letter, the feds threaten Florida with legal action, referring the matter to the Department of Justice if it cannot resolve this amicably.
I'm happy that there has been a reaction from the federal government. It lets us see that it's not just us not understanding what's going on and pushing back.
Tessa Petit is co-executive director of Florida's Immigrant Coalition, a social justice organization that advocates for immigrant rights. She's responding to a controversial move we were first to expose back in November. That's when we discovered, in response to a governor's order cracking down on illegal immigration in Florida and what DeSantis dubbed Biden's border crisis, Florida's Department of Children and Families inexplicably stopped renewing the state licenses of shelters and foster parents here who are federally funded to care for unaccompanied children when they arrive in the U.S. but before they're placed with family or sponsors here. In November, this Sarasota shelter had to relocate nearly 60 kids in its care, half of them 13 and under at the time, because the state didn't renew its license and wouldn't explain why.
This place was, for many of those children, I would say for most of those children, the first place they've ever felt safe. So yeah, sad.
After the center sued the state, DCF renewed its license last month, but not without issuing new rules for all 16 shelters in Florida that care for unaccompanied kids as part of this federal program. The rules, which won't take effect until next month, include limiting how many children are in a shelter, and it requires the feds give Florida advance notice before any child is sent to the state from the southern border. But what advance notice means remains unclear to us, these shelters, and apparently the feds. While we are open to providing needed information to understand policies and procedures, HHS could not agree to allow Florida to require individualized review in each case before children are placed in a facility, the federal letter states. Immigration advocates agree.
What happens to their protection as minor children? What happens to their protection against any form of harassment? And also, how do we not limit access to minors' information who are in the hands of the system?
Critics have called DeSantis' crackdown on kids a political play.
They should not be punished because the DeSantis administration has a grudge on the Biden administration.
The governor staunchly defending the move in an exchange with us last month.
Why are you bringing kids into this immigration debate?
I want our resources focused on needs for Florida kids and the needs we have in our communities.
In response to this letter, a governor spokesperson told us it is under review, so we do not have a response to provide at this time, adding it is ironic that instead of enforcing federal immigration law, the Biden administration would threaten legal action against our state for policies that seek to protect Floridians from the Biden border crisis and human smuggling operation.
When the feds dump people here in Florida illegally, Florida should not be made to bear the burden of our federal government's lawless open border policies.
That does not justify putting thousands of children's lives at risk and also misrepresenting what America is about. If we want to fight as adults, let's fight as adults, but don't include children in our fights.
Last summer, a similar policy was adopted in Texas by its governor, forcing dozens of shelters there to operate without a license. Shelter leaders here in Florida fear if this situation is not resolved, come February, licenses won't get renewed and these kids will be moved out.
I have faith.
If faith is a belief in a higher power,
I got faith in the big guy upstairs.
Florida spiritual leaders are trusting the governor's own faith will be enough to convince him to back off a crackdown he ordered aimed at unaccompanied migrant children.
It's not a political issue for us. It's an issue of humanity. It's an issue of compassion.
Pastor Joel Tooley leads a church in Melbourne, is a longtime immigrant advocate and part of a Christian coalition for bipartisan solutions to immigration reform. He's also leading the charge behind this letter sent to Governor Ron DeSantis Thursday night.
We can't wait for this to get worse. We have to speak. We have to act now.
Signed by hundreds of faith-based leaders from around the state, it asked the governor to withdraw an executive order he signed ordering the state's Department of Children and Families not to renew the licenses of federally funded shelters here that care for unaccompanied migrant kids as part of a decades-old federal program. The letter states in part, vulnerable children, regardless of where they are born, have the right and inherent dignity to receive love and care. Florida should not be the one saying there is no room at the inn. For Tooley, it's both biblical and personal. He operated a shelter for unaccompanied teenage boys before it was abruptly closed under the Obama administration.
We have a responsibility to care for these kids, no matter how they come, no matter what their background is.
This letter is the latest opposition to an ongoing feud we were first to expose back in November. That's when we discovered the state had stopped renewing the licenses of Florida foster families and shelters caring for migrant children, many of them faith-based. This Sarasota center had to relocate nearly 60 children in its care because the state refused to renew its state license over the order the governor described as his crackdown against Biden's border crisis.
I want our resources focused on needs for Florida kids and the needs we have in our communities.
Since then, the state adopted new rules for these shelters, limiting the number of children they can care for and requiring the feds enter an agreement detailing more about the children being sent here before they arrive, though the state has yet to clarify what many of those details mean.
It seems like what these co-op agreements are designed to do is actually slow down the process of getting kids who need care into licensed shelters quickly.
Bree Stenstrud leads a group of evangelical Christian women who advocate for immigrants and refugees. Her group also signed the letter and believes instead of forcing these shelters shut, Florida is missing an opportunity to help the thousands of Florida children also in need of care.
What would that look like to flood the foster care system with willing and able families who then, when these migrant children are reunified with their families, that they're still in the system and then trained up and ready to go, vetted and ready to go to take in a Floridian child to make a permanent placement there.
Last summer, the governor of Texas took similar action to close shelters housing migrant kids there, but eventually backed off.
Is this a new trend among Republican governors?
I hope not. It seems to be kind of this carrying on of a Trump-style rejection of migrants coming to the U.S.
I know that he does have a history of being a man of faith.
I got faith in the big guy upstairs.
I am trusting that our Catholic and Jewish and Christian and Hindu and Muslim faith community will have some influence on him and his decision, and that we'll see him act accordingly to care for the children in our society that we've been entrusted with.
Last week, we told you about another letter sent to the governor, this time by the feds, seeking clarity on some of these new rules. The feds tell us they have yet to get a response. Meantime, shelter leaders are growing concerned that without answers, their licenses will stop getting renewed beginning next month.
By your vote, show SB 1808 is reported favorably. Congratulations, Senator Bean.
Before Republicans in this Senate committee voted Monday to move forward a bill aimed at thwarting illegal immigration into the state,
I am the daughter of Nicaraguan immigrants who fled from the terrors of war.
members of the public
do not prevent shelters from housing unaccompanied minors.
took to the podium.
All children deserve to be loved and safe.
In overwhelming opposition to the bill's impact on children.
What did these kids ever do to you? Just because these children are immigrants does not make them less valuable.
The bill, a governor's political priority attacking what he calls Biden's border crisis, would strengthen current state immigration policies and would prohibit local or state governments from doing business with companies that transport undocumented migrants here.
Over the last 12 months, at least 78 federally chartered airplanes have brought illegal aliens into the Jacksonville International Airport that we know about.
Jacksonville Senator Aaron Bean introduced the bill after some flights chartered by the federal government to relocate asylum seekers and other migrants were discovered arriving in the middle of the night.
On one flight, over 50 unaccompanied alien children were locked on a plane from midnight until the crew left until 10 a.m. when a new crew arrived.
The senator acknowledged even companies transporting children who enter the U.S. without their parents but are awaiting reunification with family or sponsors through a federally funded program would face state consequences if the bill becomes law.
If they are an illegal citizen, no matter how old they are, if common carriers are participating in this practice, then yes, that common carrier would then be prohibited, should this bill pass, from doing business with the state of Florida going forward.
Democrats argued it's wrong.
This bill makes no sense. It is unconstitutional. It is wrong on a human level.
The Senate meeting comes after we were first to expose how last fall the governor ordered Florida's Department of Children and Families not to renew the state licenses of federally funded shelters who temporarily house unaccompanied children. This shelter in Sarasota had to relocate nearly 60 kids because DCF inexplicably wouldn't renew its license. After they sued DCF, the state agency renewed the license. The shelter among 8 of the state's 15 federally funded shelters for unaccompanied kids, who also sent this letter to the governor and DCF back in November, pleading to allow them to continue providing care to these children. The letter we just obtained after DCF wouldn't release it to us until we got our attorneys involved. In recent weeks, we were also first to report on similar letters sent to the governor from the American Academy of Pediatrics and hundreds of faith-based leaders, all urging him not to turn his back on kids.
It's just incredible to see our politicians focusing on an attack to children.
Isabel Vanette is co-executive director of Florida's Immigrant Coalition.
We have to keep fighting. This is not the first time that our communities are under attack. The fact that it's being immigrant children, though, is very telling, on the priorities of this legislature.
The bill will move on to the next phase in the Senate. A similar bill has been introduced in the House. Meantime, shelter providers remain unclear about the future, given there are still so many questions about whether or not the state will relicense them to care for these migrant children. We are getting some strong reaction to a letter I obtained that suggests Florida's governor is now moving forward with threats that could shut down the state to migrant kids.
The political feud between Florida's governor and President Biden appears to be reaching a new boiling point. In this letter we obtained Wednesday, legal counsel for Governor Ron DeSantis officially tells the Department of Health and Human Services it will no longer participate in a federal program to house unaccompanied children until significant changes are made.
Are we to conclude from this letter that Governor DeSantis is shutting down the state's doors to unaccompanied children?
It definitely feels that way, Katie.
Representative Anna Escamani of Orlando is the daughter of immigrants and for months has been seeking answers on the future of the more than dozen shelters in the state contracted by the federal government to house unaccompanied children once they enter the U.S., but before they're united with family or vetted sponsors here.
This is one of my worst fears. I fight for immigrant rights all the time. Never did I think there would have to be a fight over children.
DeSantis' letter, which accuses the feds of participating in a, quote, human trafficking scheme, comes months after the governor first ordered Florida's Department of Children and Families to stop renewing the state licenses of these shelters as part of a larger crackdown on illegal immigration into the state. Despite calls to revoke the order from immigration advocates, doctors, and faith-based groups, many of whom operate these shelters, DeSantis, widely rumored to be eyeing a White House bid, hasn't budged. And this letter is the latest sign he's not planning to.
This is not just anti-immigrant. This is anti-kid.
I cannot believe that they don't have any feelings for humans, for the help people that this country was all about.
74-year-old Alicia Pelez came to the U.S. without her parents when she was 13, part of a mass exodus of children from Cuba in the 1960s.
At that time, the only thing that we were running away from was maybe working in a camp or going to a school. I can imagine these kids are coming now. Heaven knows what they have experienced in their countries, what they have lived through.
A registered Republican here in Florida, she believes the governor's crackdown on kids is wrong.
This governor has kids. He should put himself in the life of these people, for 1 second to see if he has any compassion. It's really awful.
DeSantis' policies stem from what he describes as Biden's open border policies and lax immigration enforcement. In the letter, his counsel cites a surge of unaccompanied children that exploded during Biden's first year, many of whom are poorly vetted, involved in the trafficking conspiracy, or are themselves in the country unlawfully, he says. For these reasons, it states, DCF can no longer participate in or otherwise facilitate this highly flawed program until significant changes are made in federal immigration enforcement.
Still, so many questions remain, among them when this takes effect and how it impacts children currently in these shelters. Neither the feds nor the state would provide any additional clarity, but we do know from a previous letter the feds have threatened to take legal action if it could not come up with an amicable resolution with Florida. The debate over the future of migrant children in Florida is leaving the organizations that care for them in a confusing state of limbo. One of these groups tells me how it's already impacting their ability to serve children.
This is video of a recent reunion between a dad and his two sons. The boys, ages 4 and 14, had arrived in the U.S. without their parents 3 weeks ago. Their mom sent them here after the Mexican cartel kidnapped an older sibling, then threatened the family. Their story is not unique. But the faith-based group that cared for these boys and have cared for hundreds of other unaccompanied migrant children just like them,
I cannot believe this. I can't.
Continues to deal with an unknown future.
Doesn't make any sense. It doesn't.
Joanne Ortiz recruits foster families for the Bethany Christian Services in Orlando.
Why aren't you accepting more kids?
Because of the executive order.
Is that the only reason?
Yes, that's the only reason why we're not accepting kids.
The group is among the more than dozen providers in Florida stuck in limbo after the governor ordered Florida's Department of Children and Families not to renew the licenses of shelters and care providers who temporarily care for unaccompanied migrant children as part of a long-standing federal program. Bethany provides foster care to these children once they enter the U.S., but before they're reunited with family or vetted sponsors here. After months of waiting for the state to renew the licenses of their foster families, those licenses were renewed last month. But in recent emails we obtained, DCF appears to suggest the group still can't accept any more unaccompanied kids. Noticed you were placing children. Please ensure you refer to the executive order and are following it, a DCF staffer said.
They're renewed, but they can't take the kids that they're licensed to take?
Exactly.
So what's the point of that?
It's the latest confusing chapter in the governor's efforts to crack down on illegal immigration into the state by targeting, in part, shelters and providers who are contracted by the federal government to temporarily care for kids as part of a decades-old federal law. In a letter to the feds last month, DeSantis' general counsel accused the federal government of participating in a, quote, human trafficking scheme, blaming the Biden administration for pursuing open border policies and lax immigration enforcement, sending minors who are, quote, poorly vetted. As a result, DCF can no longer participate until significant changes are made in federal immigration enforcement, the letter states. For Bethany Christian, the letter only adds to the confusion over what's next.
Everybody's in a waiting period.
Yes, everybody is.
If providers start accepting children again, they could technically be defying the governor's orders.
Is what the governor is doing here, is it legal?
So that's going to be the big question in front of us, is it permissible?
Melissa Morantes is executive director for the Orlando Center for Justice, which represents immigrants, including unaccompanied children. She says the predicament facing shelters for unaccompanied kids in Florida is unprecedented and legal fights could run the gamut.
You have federal law, you have state law, and federal supersedes state. You have the division of church and state. You're talking about constitutional issues. You're talking about children's rights. So all of it's going to come into play. It's just going to be a question of, can they work it out, find a happy medium? Will this just go away?
Are you concerned about breaking the law, violating the governor's orders?
I'm concerned about the safety of the children.
Bethany Christian has just one unaccompanied child still in its care.
We have a center prepared to receive our children. We have staff that is passionate about serving the children. And there we are in the center with no children.
But the group remains hopeful more will come and eventually be reunited with family, just as the program was created to do.
A spokesperson from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services tells me they are examining all their legal options to ensure these providers can continue taking care of these unaccompanied kids here. This is arguably the most dramatic action DCF has taken on this issue since it began months ago.
Thursday afternoon, the state's top child welfare agency issuing a press release that states it is pulling out of a federal program and will no longer issue or renew the state licenses of shelters in Florida that care for migrant children as part of a federally funded program. This unless the feds enter an agreement with the state sharing more details about who's coming in and when. In a press release, DCF's head said in part, through its policies, the federal government has made a decision to encourage the mass smuggling of minors to the southern border without their parents. No government that claimed to care for children would ever tolerate this. The federal government's careless policies have led to this unsafe situation, and Florida will no longer be complicit in it. By ending the state's involvement with the program, the proposed rule will finally force the federal government to take full responsibility for the care and treatment of all the UAC population. All of this follows months of our exclusive and original reporting that discovered back in September the governor issued an order directing DCF to stop renewing the state licenses of shelters and providers who care for unaccompanied kids as a way to crack down on illegal immigration into the state and what he calls Biden's border crisis. Since then, we've reported on the backlash with immigration advocates, medical experts, and faith leaders from across the state pleading with the governor and DCF not to bring children and these shelters into the middle of a political debate.
This is the first time I've ever seen Department of Children and Families issue a statement that is political and partisan in nature.
Thursday afternoon, Representative Anna Escamani, who fights for immigrant rights, responded to the announcement.
It is unheard of for a state agency to engage in this type of political partisanship. DCF is supposed to take care of all children, not throw punches at the Biden administration.
This action only applies to unaccompanied minors, not the federal refugee program. Meantime, the feds are reviewing all options to determine if they have any legal way to fight this.
I would encourage the department to step back from this
During an audio-only public hearing over Zoom, staff from the Department of Children and Families heard the opposition.
I urge the department to withdraw the proposed rule
over and over again.
We believe that all children are human beings.
We hope that this does not get pushed through.
To a proposed new rule that lets the state's child welfare agency permanently stop issuing licenses to federally funded shelters that house migrant children who arrive here without their parents, unless the federal government enters into agreements with the state to share more details about who it's sending here. The state maintains the rule is meant to prioritize Florida children.
I have yet to hear a rational and legal constitutional reason why they claim unaccompanied children who are there and who are supported through federal funds are in some way taking away from U.S. citizen children in Florida.
During the 2-hour-long hearing, more than a dozen shelter providers, immigrant advocates, and faith-based leaders questioned the state's legal footing for the unprecedented rule, calling it vague, irrational, ill-defined, even stumping the agency over who it defines as Florida children.
Do you mean people that were born in Florida or only United States citizens?
If there's a need for additional clarification after the meeting, I think we would need to do that.
The opposition follows months of rising tensions over the governor's latest efforts to crack down on illegal immigration into the state. In the fall, we were first to discover how an executive order he signed targeted the more than dozen shelters here, contracted by the federal government to provide temporary care to unaccompanied kids once they enter the state, but before they're reunited with family or vetted sponsors here.
I would hate to work for the Department of Children and Families in the role of trying to defend this proposal.
Pastor Joel Tooley works with immigrants and led the charge behind this letter, signed by hundreds of faith-based Florida leaders. It urged the governor and DCF to back off of children and shelters, many of them faith-based. He voiced those same concerns during Thursday's hearing.
This rule actually imposes a distinction that infringes on the religious liberties.
It does feel like there is a target on our back, forcing us to choose. Are we willing to give up advocating for vulnerable children who are in the care of our communities because of political posturing? And there is no decision there. There's no middle there. Our hope is that it would actually the department would decide that they don't have the bandwidth to push this forward.
The public has until March 2nd to share with DCF their comments about this proposed new rule. Meantime, the federal government, which has a legal obligation to care for these children, is also exploring all of their options, among them letting these shelters care for these kids without a license. But that opens the door to a number of safety and legal challenges.
For the nonprofits who do this work, it's simply part of a mission.
Provide healing, hope, and help to children and families in need.
This is a calling
from God.
To love God and to serve our neighbors. And we live by that rule.
But if lawmakers approve a new rule to deny state licenses to shelters housing unaccompanied migrant children for the federal government, as long as the feds refuse to share more details, that mission to serve all will end.
We're cut in the middle the same way that the children are cut in the middle.
And new documents we obtained from Florida's Department of Children and Families shows just how much those denials could cost. According to this analysis from DCF, which created the rule and would be tasked with enforcing it, if approved by lawmakers, 17 shelters, 5 foster agencies, and some 60 foster families in Florida that temporarily house migrant children for the feds will lose all the federal money it gets to care for these kids. More than $60 million total. But the rule would still require these providers do in-person welfare checks on any unaccompanied child the U.S. government sends here. Between travel and lodging, DCF estimates costs could reach nearly $2 million within the first 6 months, and close to $17 million over 5 years, depending on the child's age.
I don't know where that money would come from to actually do those checks.
Lisette Burton with the Association of Children's Residential and Community Services works with some of these shelters. She believes these estimates are low and questions why the state would even propose a rule that shifts the burden of costs from the feds to local nonprofits or state taxpayers.
These nonprofit providers would have to come up with these dollars from somewhere to do this work, or it's something that the legislature would have to agree to fund through taxpayer dollars. That doesn't make much sense because right now this is a program that is entirely funded through federal dollars.
According to this analysis, last year, the federal program provided care to more than 4,000 unaccompanied kids in Florida. It also keeps Floridians employed, nearly 700 of them, according to these documents. If approved, Burton says some of these shelters could close, and gone with them, jobs.
We are talking about hundreds and hundreds of people who would be unemployed.
While the proposed rule is part of a broader, more aggressive effort by the governor to stop illegal immigration into the state and what he calls a human trafficking scheme by the feds, its impact on children has caused months of uproar among immigrant advocates and shelter providers who fear cracking down on nonprofits and migrant children will cost everyone involved much more than money.
What do you want to say to the governor?
Let us live our faith and let us do our mission, carry our mission, that is to care for the children and the families.
While a public hearing last week garnered nothing but opposition for the rule, it is expected to go to lawmakers for final approval.